I live in one valley over, Heinsberg, and my motivation at first in thinking about this sort of pretentious title, Making Good Towns, had a lot to do with just some of the dynamics within our own community. The talk sort of came out of watching the dynamics within my own town, and I would say a real mismatch insofar as just a coherent dialogue about how to improve, make the town better, what direction should the town grow in. When the town was at a point in its history when it was undergoing a lot of development pressure. You know, Heinsberg is, for those of you that don't know, is positioned probably about 15 miles south of Burlington. But if you drive that road from Williston or Burlington south, there's a nice stretch of, and it's somewhat rare in Chittenden County, still a nice stretch of uninterrupted road, farmscapes. The landscape is still pretty much intact. It's as if someone tied a pretty tight little cordon around Heinsberg. And, but that pattern is starting to fray a little bit. You can see vestiges or ambitions from the sort of Williston direction. Larger retail commercial endeavors are wanting to come to Heinsberg. Heinsberg's still sort of a thoroughfare for people coming from the south, from Moncton, Bristol. So people are starting to see opportunity in the town and how one zones and writes rules and has effective dialogues within the community that channel that growth in a constructive fashion is definitely sort of an issue for the community. And there's frustration in those sorts of dialogues. I think most of us, I was trained as an architect and a furniture maker, and to start thinking about how one writes rules to make communities in the way that you'd like them to be made is not necessarily something that is directly in my background. I don't feel competent or well-trained necessarily to help write those rules. And I don't like writing rules anyway. It just is not that interesting. So I started to, I gave this talk in town, and I've given it a couple of other times, and I started to try to think, well, what are some other ways of affecting how things might develop and how people in this community might think about our town, and where can we go for some reasonably coherent lessons that do make that process still rational, but also somewhat filled with emotion. So I'd studied in Norway and Denmark for a period of time and spent a lot of time in Switzerland. I didn't really give you the background that I was supposed to, I guess, that Kate was talking about. I was born in the Netherlands, and when I was a young boy, we immigrated to Canada, my family, and then ended up in New Hampshire and Philadelphia and then back here. So you've seen a lot in the way of sort of organized, more orderly growth. Netherlands and Switzerland, they're both very tidy little countries. There's a pretty broad consensus over community growth and directions that growth ought to take. But we didn't seem to have that kind of harmony. You seem to have it a little more here in the valley, but I think in some of these Burlington outlying communities, it's a little more difficult to get consensus on those things. So anyway, after a trip to Switzerland, I said, gee, it's fascinating, just from a regional standpoint or from a geographical standpoint, there's some real similarities between some of these places that I had been to. And so looking a little bit at Norway, looking a little bit at parts of Switzerland, and looking at Vermont, seemed like a rational thing to do. And were there lessons to be learned from one place going to the other? And what were these lessons, if in fact I could even decipher what they were? I mean, obviously, the severity of the terrain in parts of Norway and Switzerland are quite a bit more substantial than Vermont. Our hills are somewhat muted, you might say. The valley is not quite so deep. But in terms of just rugged weather, winter weather, environmental circumstances that we're dealing with, I think there's some real similarities. And just insofar as population density and the slow sort of evolving growth of our communities, I think there's some real parallels. So that's what I thought I'd talk about. I don't think these are, as I said, I don't have a deep interest in planning school necessarily or writing planning rules. They're just me, my travels, and some observations about some of these places and things that I saw that I thought in a general way might inform at least how I'm making things and perhaps influence others as well. So start in Norway. I don't know how many of you have been there, but it's a spectacular landscape, especially the coastal regions, but even the more subtle inland regions as you get closer to Sweden and the eastern coast of Norway. This is the Oralstad fjord. You know, many of these sort of cuts off the coast. It's a spectacular landscape. And I started by looking at the farms. There's a great book that I found, probably published in the 70s. It's called Norwegian Wood. It's written by an American. And it's basically an analysis of different kinds of farm configurations, how those farms evolved over time, how those farms adapted to differences in the physical landscape. These are just some regions that I won't identify them all, but you can see this is where the country sort of abuts Sweden. This is the western coast. This is pretty rugged. Most of the fjord lands are here. But even through Telemark, the central ridges of Norway, this is a pretty varied and undulating terrain. And these are just some examples. I'll show you some of these. You know, depending on where you are within the physical realm of this particular landscape, the farms are starting to take different kinds of forms. And those farms gradually evolve into small settlements, hamlets, villages, towns. And you can see, you know, much like Vermont, many of these communities start off as quite linear organizations along a ridge or along a small valley. Some of them, where the ground is flatter, they start to spread a little more and they start to define spaces between buildings. The main farmhouses here are called stua. And those courtyards that are created by these various buildings are called tuns, T-U-N-S. You can see it most clearly perhaps here in this Dokken Farm. This is sort of in a fairly high region, right here in the Central Highlands. But this is sort of a hilltop farm almost, where you've got around two of these tunes are, this is sort of the animal tune. And this one here is sort of more for people. Many times these families are getting much larger, so sons, daughters, all live on the farm. Everybody wants their own house. And you can see sort of gradually this assemblage of houses that starts to shape that tune. So I was interested in these farms and how they became, in a sort of general way, urban forms. And this is a little hard to see, but this is the Sondre farm. Whoops, I'm sorry. I don't know my buttons here too well yet. It's pretty much represented here. So it's a fairly gentle landscape in this particular area, but again, you're starting to see this distinction between the uphill residential neighborhood, so to speak, the downhill sort of farmstead area, not quite as disciplined as some of those other farms that I showed you. This is the Dokken Farm. This is closer to the Central Highlands again. And here the buildings are again, sorry, you know, adapting to a fairly steep terrain situation. So the definition of space between buildings is not nearly quite as concise or well articulated as in some of the other farms that I was showing a minute ago. I didn't really sort of, they tell you sometimes, tell everybody what you're going to say it, and then show it to them. But I think some of these lessons that at least I'm taking away from this are, is there something in the way that we shape our farms that tells us or informs us in some way about how we might make our villages, hamlets, and towns? That was one question I had for myself. Another was, when you're working in more isolated pockets like this, and we tend to live to some degree, it's the 20th century, but in that kind of manner ourselves, you have these isolated pockets of craftsmanship, building traditions, an adherence to sort of local and available materials. How is that filtering into the way in which we're making things? So these are, that was another, I think when you lose some of those threads in the way that we make our communities, I think they start to become communities that you could find in just about any place in this country. And yet when they're wedded to local building traditions and local building materials and strains of skill and craft that run with particular families or the traditions of the guilds, say for example in the Netherlands and other parts of Europe, you're really starting to get in a localized kind of way an identity or a personality or an authentic character to a particular community. And I think that also contributes heavily to the making of places that have integrity and honesty. And so, I'm just postulating, I guess you could say, but I think those traditions of craft exist in many of these Norwegian buildings. I mean, these are some of the hardware types, hinges. This is some of the wood scrolling on the eave of some of these buildings. Again, this is the Sandbu farm. This is the residential portion, this being the sort of animal portion. And a lot of different social functions go on in both places, whether it's slaughtering animals or weddings in this space, celebrations of one kind or another within a family. Another farmstead closer to the Swedish border. Here the landscape is a little flatter, less undulating, but again you can see the specific identity here. You're starting to see a much larger, almost hamlet form in the way that this farm has evolved. You're also seeing sort of local adaptations to fairly harsh climatic circumstances. There was a group outside, we were talking about earth roofs. The Norwegians in many of their primary residences seem to have mastered exactly how one provides extra layers of insulation on a roof, how that helps capture moisture, hold it in place. And again, these are mostly the primary buildings that you're seeing here, the primary residences called the Stu. And what's fascinating in areas like this, especially in smaller settlements where you don't necessarily have people highly specialized in making things, it's the farmer themselves, in that kind of design-build tradition, I guess, that oftentimes executes many of these more difficult details. There might be a son who really becomes proficient at particular carpentry details. So the farms, they were interesting to me, and how the farms were almost precursors to the way in which people settled. Also interesting were the Stave Churches, or the churches that really started to populate Norway and southern parts of Sweden. This was an earlier phenomenon. The Stave Churches, I'd say Christianity really came to Norway maybe around 1100. And this notion of churches as sort of beacons of community started to evolve at that particular time. Oftentimes the churches were in significant physical locations. They weren't so much at the center of a community so much as they were placed so that farms in the hinterland could visually identify with the placement of these churches. Many of these have been moved to museum locations in Norway, but several of them still remain in very prominent physical locations. This Gold Church is one of those. The Borgund Church is in a place called Leerdal, mostly built around 1100, 1200, cautiously preserved at this point. But also in terms of, I don't have a tremendous technical understanding of how these churches were built, but to a large degree they were sort of pole structures with supporting side aisles almost. The scale of these things are interesting. When you go to Scandinavia today, just about everyone's bigger than I am. And yet I felt quite at home on these porches. You know, if you were 5'4", 5'5", the scale and proportion of these places was really quite revealing. Oftentimes in terms of just dealing with snowy, wintry weather, many of these have completely, surrounding porches that help keep the weather away from the base of the building and also enable you to sort of enter at multiple points. You would also find, this is a country where, at least at that particular time, the wildlife that really provided sustenance, was something to be celebrated for religious purposes. And the level of decoration of many of these meeting houses and churches reflected that craft tradition and their dependence on animals in this particular area. Another thing that fascinates or came to fascinate me was this idea that if you have any amount of reverence for the way in which we gather ourselves together in communities, there's a kind of comparable relevance to an affection for the hinterland, an affection for the countryside. If you value the way in which we congregate together as human beings, this seems somewhat self-evident perhaps, but there's a kind of reverence for the countryside as well. And this is manifest perhaps a little more obviously in some of the things that are going on in Norway right now. They started a program, maybe a decade ago. Some of you might be familiar with it, but it's somewhat directed at spending excess oil money and somewhat at encouraging tourism or a physical understanding of the nation. And throughout many parts of Norway, you'll find vantage points, points off water routes that really get you a little closer in some ways to what you're able to see and observe. And this is one sort of very gentle insertion just along the coast. Just a little promontory they'd cut into the rock. This one, the Stave Fjord, is a much more dramatic outlook. But this real almost kind of dramatic confrontation or ability to observe what nature is showing you. And that was an interesting theme. I think we do that to a degree in our nation, in our state, and in other places as well, where this affection for the countryside translates itself into something that comes about. I gave another talk actually about 20 of these different things that scatter themselves up and down the coast of Norway. Some celebrating events of, there was apparently a witch trial in the very northern portion of Norway on the coast that they built a monument to, but much of this is sort of these physical places and how do we interact and observe and involve ourselves with it in a more substantial way. So this is one way of revering, I guess, the countryside. So it's called the Norwegian National Tourist Route. They have a fantastic website where you can. Anybody seen any of this before? I know Dan has. Yeah, some pretty dramatic and in some cases some fairly subtle places along the shoreline or inland that that put you in touch with nature. Maybe not always quite in the way that you'd hoped, but. So some of those same lessons I found, spent some time in a province in the northeast of Switzerland called Graubünden. Some of the smaller cities and towns that are in that direction is Chur, Davos, and I went with a friend to visit a couple of different architects and see some of the work that they were doing. But again, very dramatic landscapes. This is a lot of 10, 12, 15,000 foot peaks with small villages, towns, and hamlets literally creased in the valleys. And a less organized way, it's almost as if someone just scattered confetti and let it fall, and that was the sort of figure ground or a placement of structures within a particular village. And you'll see here, this is Vrinn. It's probably a village of about 300 people. We spent about 3 or 4 nights there. It's as if someone, tied a pretty tight little cordon around the village itself and where one could actually place a structure. And then again, that kind of reverence for the hinterland. Most of what you're seeing out here, these little white dots, are all little shepherd huts and trailways that lead you up the hillsides. So very much this kind of dependency between the supporting landscape and the village of Vrinn itself. Very clear demarcation between where the town, where the village, where the hamlet ends, and the supporting hillside. And it was inviolate. It was almost like something that was sacred in some ways. It's a little like the making of Rome with that mythological story about Romulus and Remus, where they basically delineated the perimeter of Rome, and it was something that you didn't even step over. It was sacrilegious to do so. And it seems as if many of the ways in which some of these villages are shaped, there's that similar kind of adherence to an unwritten law that says, this is our edge, and from here, the land's too valuable, we don't use it. We create other villages in other places. So. We were actually, this was another notion that we had that I maybe am over-romanticizing it in some ways. This notion of the village architect. I think in Vermont here we work in a smaller realm in some ways, and it's oftentimes the people that know and work in a place that they somehow have the ability to evoke the most genuine response or most appropriate response to a problem that arises when you have to build something. And in this particular town, there was a wonderful young architect. He was in his 40s. He didn't really speak English. He spoke German, but he had a young son who was about 14, was a Montreal Canadiens hockey fan. He spoke pretty good English, so we could talk with him. And his father was basically doing work throughout this village. And we liked the sort of almost pell-mell nature. I mean, obviously at this point, the hill is starting to rise. The same's happening on the other side. But the buildings are almost, as I said before, spread like confetti. This is the school right here. This is the church and a small mortuary chapel. And these are a series of small slaughterhouses. There's a public square that's almost hard to decipher right here. And this architect, his name was Gino Caminetti. There was a small mill shop in town, but a very, very sophisticated mill shop. They made windows, doors, prefabricated building components. The architect had designed their particular mill shop, was working closely with them on a host of different projects. This is the slaughterhouse, sort of a sequence of 3 different buildings. They were all used for slightly different purposes. This was a kind of community project. I think many of the regional farmers, there'd been a slaughterhouse in an adjoining town that wasn't serving them well anymore, needed a new facility, and Caminetti designed that for them. It was a sort of a very special sort of wall ventilation system that he was using in this particular abattoir. He designed the village phone booth, which was a sort of wonderful wood laminate structure. They had cell phones, they were coming. This was maybe 6 or 7 years ago. But the phone booth was still getting lots of use. As I said, a small mortuary chapel. And although largely sort of a contemporary modern architect, he was paying attention to, you know, the sourcing of materials nearby. I mean, huge slates on the roof of this particular structure. The mill shop was milling most of the heavy timbers that he was using in the construction. He designed residences. This was a multi-generational house that he did for, I think, 3 different family segments within the village. Some real topographical challenges. And although not being literal with, say, some of the more traditional detailing, the overall way in which he used wood had a strong sort of historical bent to it. One of the most fantastic projects that he did was a school gymnasium meeting room. And we were astounded, actually. He was working with a Swiss engineer on this, a guy named Konzit. And the truss on this particular gym, you can see it up here. It had various sort of galvanized steel clamps. They were using these smaller boards in this particular instance, and these were all in tension, and they could move independently of one another. So with heavier snowfalls, the roof literally was this sort of dynamic structure, some fantastic views to the surrounding landscape. The entire interior was wood. You know, basically an elementary school gym, but a very, very special and incredibly well crafted project. Another thing that was interesting to us was we were noticing that you know, this village was probably 2.5, 3 hours from Zurich, and maybe 45 minutes from a large town not too far away called Chur. And yet we kept seeing this one sort of bus. It looked a little like this. It was a smaller version of this particular bus. This is in Chur, actually. And we started to ask around a little bit. We realized that the transport system was really consisted almost, in addition to individual automobiles and scooters, consisted almost entirely of this bus. And the bus had racks on it for bicycles. The bus had racks on it so that the local mill shop could pile windows on it and deliver it to other towns. The bus carried packages. The bus carried the post. The bus transported school kids. The bus transported the elderly. It had a handicapped, accessible lift. So basically, as opposed to having UPS trucks, FedEx trucks, the mail system, all sorts of different forms of transportation plying these pretty challenging road systems, they just had one bus. It was doing everything. And you wonder to some degree, you know, I know I've had the FedEx truck come down my driveway, and it seems like a preposterous system that we have in place where all of these individual modes of transport are running all these different errands when if you could concentrate them in some rational way, you could dramatically reduce the amount of traffic on the roads and also provide a frequency of service and a level of access for those that are incapable of driving, whether it's the young or the elderly or the handicapped. It just provided a system of transportation to a much larger segment of the population. And it seemed like such a common sense Now, this is the Swiss government being somewhat dictatorial, I'm sure, but it was a very rational method and approach to transportation. So that was not a novel idea, but certainly one that I thought we could learn something from. And also, you know, much like Vermont, it wasn't just like transportation was humdrum. Moving about, getting somewhere, had some special purpose. And the structures they used to accommodate roads, the tunnels, these all had sort of a clear sense of purpose, but also their own sort of aesthetic identity. So it wasn't just about moving about, it was moving about with some revels. You know, it was an enjoyable process, or one to be enjoyed. And much like the Norwegians, but perhaps in a slightly less obvious way, the Swiss also had this reverential relationship with the landscape. And whether it was the use of the landscape insofar as farming, forestry practices, or just hiking, enjoyment in that countryside. You could see everywhere signs of the value of that landscape just by virtue of how they made it accessible to you. This is now the same engineer that did the, we met with this fellow. He was a very, very fascinating guy. This is about a 140-foot long suspension bridge made out of stainless steel and stone. And it's basically part of a hiking trail network through Switzerland. And just the notion that someone would build such a, this was like a piece of, you know, jewelry or watchcraft in the way that it was made. You can, basically this was suspended from cables that also sort of supported the upper portion of the rail. These were stainless steel rods that went to a sort of a transverse piece on the bottom, and then substantially tied at either end, but very gracefully done. Very lovely, very beautiful bridge. And the fact that this was where it was on this deep gorge as a way for hikers to find their way across that gorge, you know, we found admirable. A slightly less successful project, but was another bridge that Conzit had done. This is all in a region, actually, of Switzerland where I went to architecture school with these two fellows up front here. And we had a fellow there who taught sort of building practice. And he always used to equate the sort of spareness of material with some sort of tangible item that you might want to possess, whether it was a fine liquor or a good cigarette or whatever it was, so that he would always say, well, if you could reduce the amount of material in this particular bridge or structure, it would mean that, you know, you could have so many more packs of Gauloise or so many more glasses of whatever it was that you wanted. So there was this kind of direct equation. And right in this particular area was a very famous bridge by a bridge designer named Maillard. It's now also a pedestrian bridge, but it was one of these bridges that utilized a very modest amount of concrete and in the process of spanning a pretty substantial a gorge. And this fellow was very much in that tradition, this Conzit fellow. So this particular bridge was designed such that it could be basically, it wasn't as long as the stainless steel bridge that I just showed you, but also a bridge strictly for pedestrian purposes in the countryside. It was put in place, it was basically built off-site and then dropped in place with a helicopter. So that the whole structure had to be able to be airborne so that one could deliver it to this place. The foundations had been pre-prepared. Unfortunately, the big problem here was that about 6 months after they put the bridge up, an avalanche came down and completely removed the entire structure. This was about 3 or 4 months before or after we had been there. So that was really quite unfortunate. They obviously hadn't analyzed carefully enough just exactly what some of the local environmental circumstances might do to their bridge. But nonetheless, a beautiful bridge when we saw it. And spare and economical in the way that they used wood and steel cabling. You also get, you can detect in Switzerland this continued, as I said before, reverence for the landscape, use of the hinterland. They had built a whole series of these small forestry laboratory buildings throughout the country, and there were maybe 6 or 7 not too far from Zurich in the direction of Graubünden where we were. And these were mostly educational centers. Forestry officials would use them to teach locals good forestry practice. It was a place where you could come, utilize the place as a resource for information about a variety of things that had to do with the use of wood. And again, the amount of devotion, special qualities that they imbued these little buildings with. And also buildings that were exemplary in the way that they utilized wood in a very spare sort of way. They were modest buildings, really, but clever. And you'd go there to get lessons in chainsawing or something like that. And the fact that a country would spend this amount of effort and resource accommodating that kind of purpose was something that impressed us. A lot of research, that's happening more and more, obviously, today, but into wood, its preservation, its long-term use. Another place that we, not too far from this other village that we talked about called Vrinn, was another small, slightly larger, a village called Vals. And again, very distinct sort of outline, very linear in nature, this village, very close to some very distinct natural resources, in particular a kind of hard, almost soapstone colored kind of stone that was quarried in a local small-scale mining pit. And also home, again, this notion of an architect who understands local circumstance, not that they're the only ones that do that, but that enable them to make things in these places that that have a real direct connection with the place. This is a small chapel, the St. Benedict Chapel. We went to visit with this fellow also. He's become a little more famous than he was when we last saw him, a guy named Peter Zumthor. And this was just a small chapel that sat on a hillside, a little like the Norwegian tradition I showed you, where the chapels and religious buildings are somewhat distinct from the community. Mostly a wooden structure, very beautiful on the interior, very small, maybe 40 seats. And almost the inverse, another small chapel that really was situated more within a small village called Bonaduz. This one is substantially buried. But the importance, much like those Stave Churches I showed you in Norway, and I guess on my own part, you sometimes start to ask, do these buildings still have relevance, or within the public realm, are we still sort of focused on creating useful buildings that really serve the larger public realm? And are we still making buildings like that? And I was initially a little skeptical that we in Vermont were doing that, but I was actually, by going through this process, feeling a little more encouraged about it. And this is hardly a modest public building, but still a building that seemed to know the place that it was in. We were actually looking for this structure. It's a spa. in Val's, and we were kind of walking around, and finally we realized that we were on the roof of this particular building. You see the rooftop here. It had these sort of creased skylights that let light, much like you see here in this photograph, in, and then you saw the landscape in the distance. Again, the sort of varied shepherd huts in different places. So the building was basically shelved into the hill in a very gentle way. And this was the sort of opposing face made of the stone that I was talking to you about before. So just, it was almost like the whole structure had been kind of shelved into this hillside. And from many vantage points was completely inconspicuous. I didn't happen to get or show you the shot here. When we got there, there were about 20 goats basically grazing on this roof and crapping all over the skylights too. And then a little more majestic, you know, when we start to talk about buildings in the public realm, this is across the border in Austria, in Bregenz, an art museum by the same architect again. And this very much in the, you know, a building that both protects the art, but also from an environmental standpoint, a pretty savvy structure. It was one of the few buildings that we've come across where they were basically using water as a medium for both heating and cooling. They had, if you can picture it, sort of a concrete slab that turned up the wall and then used an exterior glazing system, a double glazing system, almost, you can see it here, it sort of would lap over itself, and use that as a climatic control device. So it was a very diffuse light that worked its way into the gallery. Again, you know, much in that Swiss tradition, exquisite detailing and very innovative use of a building skin. But definitely an importance placed on making public buildings, buildings that served a broader cultural purpose. And we, of course, asking ourselves, are we making buildings like this? Are we given the opportunity to make buildings like this? So then we came to Vermont. And I would say many of those things that I highlight about Norway, I'm not insistent about it, but, and in Switzerland, they in their own quiet way have sort of filtered into our ways of making communities and towns in this particular state. You know, I think we arrived here, as I understand it, in the 1600s. There was definitely sort of a fear of the landscape. The wild was something that people were apprehensive about. Much of the state was forested. And that domestication, that transformation to the land sustaining us, I think that took at least a century or more. But the patterns, you know, these are pretty much modern day Google Earth images of various communities around our state. This is Stratford over on the eastern side. You know, pretty much this is a fairly tight little valley. It spreads in both directions. To the south, Tunbridge; to the north, Williamstown. I'm sorry, not Thetford. But in addition to the kind of strung out nature of this community, the sort of digression, you've probably seen, you know, there's the main sort of more formidable house fronting the street, the road, and then it sort of fritters as you go back, a variety of other uses happening. And that pattern was certainly a dominant one in the way that we shaped our towns back then, and they continue to sort of grow in many ways like that. But what was interesting about these communities when they originally took shape, late 1700s, the notion of building a building for a very aggressive public purpose, meeting religious purposes, was pretty much a foregone conclusion in most of these communities. And you had some beautiful structures built at that particular time. This is late 1700s, the Stratford Meeting House, still pretty much intact in this way. We actually helped them a little while ago with a new heating system. Oftentimes itinerant builders, architects, I don't think architects were really a known entity at that point, but meandered about the countryside. Many of the details of these buildings came from the South, Massachusetts, Connecticut, southern New Hampshire. But definitely buildings of pride, extensive public use, and very much at the center of these communities. At the same time, you know, that same connection with the land that I've described in some of these other places. This is the backside of Mount Mansfield. This building's also recently been restored in Rockingham. The meeting house there, built in 1787, about the same time as the Stratford Meeting Hall. And again, that kind of adaptation to, you know, fairly dynamic, well, we've seen the consequences actually of some of this with the flooding last year. You know, communities built in challenging geographic terrain, like Brattleboro, you know, a town that definitely sort of follows its water courses up and down, and a challenge to build in a place like that. Most of those linear communities, the smaller scaled ones, stayed that way. The bigger ones, when there was a demand for growth, they started to spread up the hillsides. And that was a more difficult pattern, I think. Where you have communities like Richmond, and the focus here is the Round Church, which sits in this particular location. But again, more of a linear community, but starting to cross and develop sort of little hamlet-like nodes in some other directions. This is a slightly later time period, 1812. This is Chelsea, Vermont. A little more of a cross pattern that you get going. Actually, this is the town that has Tunbridge to the south and Williamstown to the north, and some cross traffic. So you're starting to see some varied patterns of settlement, but very distinct. You know, I'm sure many of you know that one of the few communities in Vermont that has this kind of dual public space green. One a little more of a civic courtroom function, the other a little more of a public market function. This, I think, is the courthouse. But that creation of important public buildings and important public spaces that oftentimes go with those buildings was what I was fixated on, I guess. And, you know, asking ourselves that question, are we still doing this? Should we still be doing it? And is this the generator of a good town, a good village, a good city? And you get it in cities like Burlington. I think, you know, still, by most standards, a fairly modestly sized city, but I'm not sure exactly what the date of this is, 1800, but this is the original block layout of Burlington. And you see a pretty concise pattern with block sizes that, lot sizes that accommodate that dense pattern. And again, almost agricultural sized lots as one moves away from that center portion. So that attitude of at least trying to draw a cordon around settled areas existed at the time. Again, that continuation of important public buildings. The Capitol in Montpelier. Other cities that, you know, a little like Brattleboro. Barry's probably not quite so challenged vertically, but, you know, a fair amount of undulating topography. but also very much a center insofar as skills and local building materials being housed there. An immigrant population that came that had a particular set of skills that really spread itself not just around this state but throughout the country. This is the famous graveyard in Barrie. But even some of the supporting, this is a small fire hall in Barrie. You know, again, that level of masonry and stone craftsmanship, you know, found its way into these structures. And that was a tradition that was carried on. The Museum of Natural History in St. Johnsbury, again, a little more of a late 1800 structure, but you know, call it pride in craftsmanship, pride in the importance of buildings that serve a broader cultural purpose. These were definitely buildings that were made at that particular time. Transportation too, you know, I think that we have a rich history of wonderful bridges in this state. It's sad sometimes to watch the, what are they called, the Agency of State Transportation, and they're rather modest and unspectacular bridges that we build today, by and large. And you compare, this is a bridge in Highgate. It's now been put over to pedestrian use, sits close to the center of Highgate Village. This is, I think, still one of the longest, it's in Swanton, one of the longest covered train bridges in the United States, crossing, I think, the Missisquoi River. And other forms of transportation at the time that, I don't know if any of you have been over to Shelburne Museum recently, but the craftsmanship and quality of transportation that was available to people on the lake. I wonder if we spent a little less time building bridges like that Crown Point Bridge and maybe put a little more money into fast-moving boats up and down the lake, that we might not be a little bit better off. But much like Norway, Switzerland, a fairly rich tradition insofar as how we approach transportation. So that gets me to now. And as I said, I started off not entirely hopeful, I guess, but when you really start to look at it a little more carefully, there are structures being built today that, while certainly different in their aesthetic appearance, they continue on that tradition of making buildings for public use, oftentimes in spectacular natural locations. This is the Echo Museum in Burlington that sits right on the waterfront. I think it was built maybe 10 years ago. You know, a distinct amount of care taken in its execution. It's a pretty good building from a performance standpoint, and very much the center of the waterfront in many respects. This is maybe a meek excuse for a fine transportation structure, but because most of us can't afford to get around this way anyway, but it comes down to places of work, you know. I think commerce is taking on an increasing importance in the way that we run our lives, and many of the buildings that serve that commercial purpose, you know, have taken over the roles of some of the kind of exquisite public buildings that maybe we were building 200 years ago. Somewhat unfortunate, but another place of work in Heinsberg, this is in our town, and very much Bill designed this building. And an interesting dynamic in our community. You know, this is a revered place to work, I would say, for most people in our community. And a building that's held up in as a model of future development for much of what the village aspires to. So it's been interesting to sort of see this just as a place of work, but also as an example for the rest of the community in terms of the kinds of quality buildings that people are hoping will be built as our village tends to grow. So you've got similar examples in other communities. This is a nice mixed-use series of structures in White River Junction, which is really undergoing a fairly substantial revival. And many of these structures are kind of combined residential, commercial, and more active commercial on the lower floors. Pretty high quality place to work and live. And many of these things, I guess one could say, well, Rolf, these are reflections of how we live, work, recreate, educate ourselves today. And the importance we place on these buildings is an outcome of that set of priorities. And there's a distinct and actually very admirable social consciousness to many of the structures that we're building today. This is the food shelf on North Winooski Avenue in Burlington. And basically provides meals, emergency food supplies to people who don't have it. And the fact that the city of Burlington, not through city funds necessarily, but that our social priorities are such that these buildings manifest themselves, I think is a wonderful reflection of our society's priorities. And maybe these are the public buildings that deserve to be admired and replicated in some way. And who would think, I mean, I showed you the museum on the Burlington waterfront. Some of the most vibrant and desirable locations on the Burlington waterfront over the last 20 years have been given over to public housing projects, accessible to just about anyone. And this is one of those. It's the Mermaid Building, sort of sits across from where Burlington College used to be. Again, from the upper floors of this structure, you have fantastic vantage points over Lake Champlain. And yet, it's a modest, affordable housing project in downtown Burlington. So, but well made. This is another one, the waterfront housing project, which again serves people of all different income levels, different ages, and in the way that it's configured, the lake is basically right here to your left. So insofar as creating important publicly used buildings that sit adjacent to a surprisingly beautiful natural resource, I guess I admire this, There's a lot of controversy around this project. This is the Fletcher Allen Hospital complex, just to the north and east of the University of Vermont. This in many ways seems to be the kind of edifice, one could say, that gets built not necessarily in tribute, but in service to our health issues. And certainly a structure that cost a lot of money. I think there are parts of it that are very well done. There's some historic preservation efforts that have gone on around this complex that are really quite admirable. And insofar as a well-lit, reasonably cheerful, if you're feeling at all cheerful when you go to a hospital, this is a public building of current purposes that is essential, it seems, to the way in which we live. This is its more modest equivalent in Plainfield, a little health center that was probably built 25 or 30 years ago. An architecture firm that was from around here, I think, called Circus Studios. And then recently renovated by some creative fellows from Burlington, expanded slightly. And it's the local health clinic in Plainfield. So, and again, very much a building of public purpose at the center of the community. And I would say built by the village architect, even though he didn't live in that particular village. But So that's what I've got to say about towns, and there's nothing authoritative in my opinion, but just, I'd say, observations about some places that physically have some affinity to where we're living and working, and some observations about what might make our communities a little bit better than they are. So if you've got any questions or not, I'm happy to answer them.